So I'm Gaurav Bhatia. Just a brief background about me before I start. I started my career at Oracle back in the mid-90s, and that was around the time where web security was just starting to pick up. SSL, all the protocols, and so for the first 10 years of my career, I started building web security products at Oracle, single sign-on, identity management, and stuff like that. And then I kind of went out and worked on products, not security products, but products that were built on the cloud, products that had a strong machine learning component and were using the cloud heavily. And that's when I kind of got involved back with security again, because I started to see the challenges with building stuff on the cloud, deploying applications on the cloud, and it was this feeling of deja vu, where a lot of the landscape was shifting again to cloud, the way the applications were being coded, the way the applications were being deployed, and a lot of the security challenges were again coming back to the forefront, but in a different fashion. So like Bikash also talked about earlier, a lot of the concepts and a lot of the stuff is is the same from a security standpoint, but it's a different different landscape. So about last year, is when I started getting involved with the space again, and recently joined this company called Palera. So to start with, if we take kind of like a layered approach to security, we start looking at we take a perspective and we say we've got a layer of security where we've got the network, we've got the protocols, we've got ports, MAC addresses. We've got IP addresses and things going on at that level that we're trying to secure. There's a certain level of abstraction and certain level of understanding of what this system is like. There are actors in the systems, there are things that they're trying to do, and then there are resources that they're trying to access. Right? So you've got a machine that's trying to connect to another machine over a certain protocol. So that kind of constitutes the first level or the first layer of security. And then you take it one level higher in the layer, and then you build a different set of abstraction on top, right? You start to now think of users, you now start to think of URLs, you start to think of like HTTP forms, you start to think of sessions, you start to think of cookies, SQL injection, cross-site scripting and other stuff. And that's when your level of abstraction in terms of security goes a level higher, right? You start to think of differently. There are users, they're trying to access resources, but again, at a certain level of abstraction. And really where CASB fits in is the next level of abstraction higher, which is a layer on top, which says, I've got users that I've protected through the network. I've got users and I managed to keep the bad guys out at level 2 also, right? Now, once they're inside my application, what is it that they're doing and what is it that I need to protect against, right? So that's where the conversation kind of changes with CASB, where you start to now look at a level of abstraction where you've got actual users, you've got employees, you've got admins, you've got partners, you've got contractors, and then you've got resources in the cloud. You've got Salesforce contacts, you've got Office 365 files, you've got Office 365 emails, you've got Google Drive files, you've got incidents that you've created in ticketing applications like ServiceNow, or you've got code that you've checked into GitHub, right? All of these are examples of commonly used cloud applications. And so now the level that you're operating at is you're looking at users who are trying to access these resources. And what you're trying to do is see that the right users have access to the right set of resources, and then behaviors that are anomalous are kept out of the system. So here's just one slide that talks about some of the breaches here that have commonly been discussed. So I won't go into it, but the point of putting this out here was that CASB by itself is not going to be a silver bullet, right? It has to be looked at in this form of a holistic security model. and looked at from the point of view of looking at security as a whole, but then also having the right amount of remediation and steps that have to be taken once those threats are identified. So Target, for instance, one of the breaches, there were a lot of the alerts that had gotten generated, but there was this alert fatigue that had set in, without which they were ignored. So one important part of it is not just the monitoring and the detection, but also the remediation aspect. So, oops, trying to point this somewhere. Okay. Going back a little bit to the challenges, if you look at the changing landscape, a lot of the security threats that you don't envision or you don't experience in the first two levels start to suddenly become relevant, right? Because now imagine that you've got a user who is an employee, who is logging in with the right credentials, who has full access to be able to view and download your Salesforce data, all your company contacts, but has all of a sudden downloaded 500 contacts the day before they're about to leave, right? Before the last day of employment. And so this, is one of those classic examples where you just cannot apply standard, rules or certain URLs to block or certain, filters in place, where you really need a deeper level of insight and intelligence into what the user is doing, and be able to model your security behavior and your security posture and your risk around those behaviors. Right? The other is, thing that makes it challenging is the whole concept of cross-cloud. Right? So you've got when you talk about cloud, you've got your applications like Salesforce, Office 365, and others that we talked about. But you've also got IaaS, you've got PaaS, right? You've got Amazon, where you've built all your custom apps and you've deployed them over there. So those also need to be secured. And how do you track a user when they're going between these different applications, right? What if a user downloaded from your company Box account 50 files, right? And then emailed those 50 files out to an email that was a competitor's email or their own Gmail, right? Now, in isolation, they may or may not constitute a threat, but put together, looking at it holistically and as a transaction, this would certainly raise alerts and raise eyebrows, right? And then being able to aggregate the data from a lot of the different SaaS applications, which have all of their own security models and security objects and ways to secure data is certainly an important challenge to solve. We talked about incident management a little bit before. So let me talk a little bit more about CASB. So deployment models, right? So we've discussed how you've got the user, you've got the applications, there's a bunch of data flowing through. Now, how do you actually build this intelligence or this insight, this threat alert, flagging on top of this? And there are various approaches to it. The two common approaches at a very high level are you put a server, a proxy, an appliance, or whatever you want to call it, in between the user and the cloud app, right? And that is one pattern. And because everything is flowing through you, through this central server, you can look at all the traffic, mine the traffic, and build your security analytics and security enforcement on top. The other is you download the security metadata and behavior and the audit records in an out-of-band fashion, where you are not sitting in front and in the center, in the middle of the user and the cloud app. So the first one, building on the proxy-based solution is the forward proxy solution. So what happens in this kind of a deployment model is you've got managed devices. these could be basically machines, laptops, end user devices, that you now configure in such a way, in again, a very centralized top-down IT policy sort of fashion, to be able to route all the traffic through this central server. And when you get to the central server, the CASB proxy, which is here, looks at all the data and then would apply the different rules on top. Bikash talked about encryption of data. You could extract stuff out, certain fields. You could configure certain, sensitive fields, do the encryption, and then forward the requests out to your cloud app. You could model monitoring. You could model different kinds of behavior on top of this. So in terms of, the benefits of this approach or pros of this approach, you could include this for all kinds of applications, right? Not just web-based applications. You could have thick clients because you have a central, proxy sitting in between all your requests. The difficulty, of course, would be if you have a shop where people, bring their own devices, you would run into issues in terms of not being, flexible to the end user's needs in terms of, supporting their devices. And of course, because everything gets routed through these, centralized proxies, there could be instances where there could be privacy issues where, let's say I'm using my own personal Gmail, for some activity at work, that is also going to now flow through this. The proxy also ends up becoming a single point of failure. Earlier Bikash talked about latency or performance issues. Now, if you're funneling in all your requests and all your traffic through this one server, the server itself could, potentially become a source of a bottleneck. The next approach is, again, a proxy approach, but a reverse proxy. So in this case, you've got your managed devices, but the way you configure this is through URL rewriting, DNS rules, where when you try to access a server, it goes through your proxy. And the difference here being that you would allow unmanaged devices, because if the user types salesforce.com, it would go through an internal server, get redirected, routed through the proxy, you would basically control traffic here. Again, you would then forward the traffic out to the servers, the cloud servers, and then you would basically do your monitoring that way. The difference in terms of pros and cons, you would have, you can support managed and unmanaged devices just because of the way you're configuring your networks to go through a central proxy. You would have end user privacy not be a major issue because your routing would work in a manner like that. And easier to deploy because you would not have to mandate a lot of configuration on end users' devices in terms of certain redirection. It's more of a centralized solution as opposed to a endpoint device centric solution. And again, CASB may become a single point of failure in such a scenario. Also, in terms of if you have a proxy in between, if you're trying to do the SSL handshake and terminate it at the server and then restart it, those are some of the things that you would need to look at. Now, the third approach is very different from the first two approaches, and this is the API approach. And what happens in this one is you've still got your basic security infrastructure in the company, which is your firewall and other stuff. But what you do is you do not have any footprint or any server between the end user and the cloud application, right? So they access the application how they normally would. And what you do is, in an out-of-band fashion, you connect. When I say you, I mean the CASB on behalf of you connects to these cloud applications and downloads all the security-related events and security-related logs and metadata and event data. Right? Now, this is a fundamentally different approach to tackle the problem, because by not having a proxy in between, you eliminate two important things. One is the need for doing any configuration. It's very lightweight, light touch, nothing on the user side, nothing on the IT admin side that needs to be done. And it's out of band, right? So you could deploy the solution in an independent fashion by simply getting the right credentials to the cloud application to be able to download it. Of course, this approach has the limitation that you would need to be able to connect to all the cloud applications. Many of the cloud applications may not have APIs or may have limited set of APIs in which in which case you would need to do some screen scraping and other stuff. The good part tends to be that at least all the major vendors, if you look at a Salesforce or Google Apps or Amazon, have pretty rich and extensive APIs, but that does remain a limitation of this approach. So just to kind of summarize, because there's nothing sitting in between your end users and your cloud apps, it's lightweight, light touch. You could also support end users when they're not inside your firewall and out inside the roaming. And the con, of course, tends to be that you would need to work around the approaches. So, yeah, question. Sorry, is there a question? Okay.
So, in what circumstances or what scenario we can use the forward proxy or reverse proxy deployment model or this API mode? So, where it would be really suits which kind of a scenario? Because we do agree that it may be a single point of failure. Yeah. But again, if we use API mode, again, we are not really sure about the heavyweight components which are involved in terms of the performance. But so if you could suggest in what scenario we can use this deployment model, that would be great.
Yeah, that's a really good question. So,
thank you.
Bikash talked a little bit about sanctioned IT apps, unsanctioned IT apps. So if you look at the whole cloud security challenge, right? The first thing you want to find out and discover is what are the apps that people are using in the first place, right? Like inside your company, what are the cloud apps people are accessing? Are people using Dropbox, right? Their personal Dropbox account. What kind of data are they putting into that application, right? What are the files that they're putting in that? So that's your first kind of problem that you want to solve. So I think that's where the proxy solutions work really well, right? Because they're sitting in between all the traffic. They're able to intercept that and give you a report, nice report that says, hey, look, here's the set of applications that's being accessed from your environment, right? And then so once you've kind of discovered your apps, then the next thing you want to do is figure out how what's going on in these apps, going around in these apps, right? What are people doing? How many people are logging in? Once they're logging in, what is the kind of activity that they're doing? What kind of files are being downloaded? And then, if you, at that point, want to start and do some inline encryption, let's say, which Bikash also referred to earlier, and you want to say, hey, whenever this piece of traffic leaves this app, my network, make sure it's encrypted, right? So all salary data that goes and sits in Workday, for instance, right? I want that to be encrypted, just to take a hypothetical example. Now, in that case, you do need an inline solution, right? Because going out of band and downloading something is not going to solve that encryption, although you could solve that in different ways. Once the data is at rest, you could go in and encrypt files, you could save files there. those are the two, use cases where you would use these solutions there. So those are the two, use cases where you would use these solutions. The other stuff where once you've kind of figured out what the apps are, what, is being done, then getting the monitoring, the insights, figuring out who's doing what, mining that data for threats, figuring out anomalous behavior on top of that. All those things, you could, do in both approaches. Pros and cons we talked about, the API approach being lighter weight.
So is it possible, is it good to have the hybrid model, both the forward proxy, reverse proxy, as well as the API mode?
Yeah.
It's a question, yeah.
Yeah. So I think a lot depends on the use cases you're trying to solve, right? I think, the products in the market, the vendors, sometimes some of them have a hybrid approach, some of them focus on a certain need. Many of the products are complementary as well, right? So when I talked earlier about, kind of looking at it as a holistic thing, you really need to figure out, what your specific needs are. If data encryption is not a need, you may not need the specific solution. If you're trying to focus more in terms of getting insights, monitoring, tracking anomalous behavior, looking at, once the threats come in, doing something about them, having good remediation practices in place, having those threats become incidents in a ticketing system, right? Then it's a different set of use cases and a different set of vendors that you would look at. Yeah, sorry.
Site and secondary site, so how do you configure this solution? How do you deploy the solution?
When you say primary, secondary, you mean like for the cloud app?
Yeah, I mean you have a primary site, you have a DR site, right? So if you implement a particular solution in the active site, so how about the passive? How the data will be patched up in the passive? So is there any deployment which has to be, like how it has to be deployed? So is there any step-by-step procedure like which we need to follow for that?
Right. Yeah, so I think, that goes back to, again, some of the pros and cons of, which model you pick. If you take like an API-based approach, then it really doesn't matter. As long as, the remote CASB system can connect to the cloud app, that's all you need, right? You don't need anything here. If you want to deploy it from a proxy-based solution, then I think it really depends on your network architecture, where you placed it, where your sort of global traffic management is done, where the redirection is done, and then I think it's very network specific where you would place the proxies.
So you don't have to worry about like how, as you said, it is basically depend on the office network. See, what I'm saying is if there are two locations, site A and site B, right? So most of my traffic will be active at site A. So if site A goes down, site B will be active. So in those scenario, will it be the same case what you talked about now? Like you have the same solution at both the places?
Yeah, so, again, it depends on how you would have architected your network, right? Like if you're talking about like you're talking about having a proxy and how do you make that disaster recovery enabled, right? So you could have two proxies in both sort of data centers, or if you have a centralized solution, you would have it at a common layer which then redirects traffic to both the places and then replicate that out so that that itself doesn't become a single point of failure. I think it's very network topology centric. Yeah.
Overall, the cloud
Yeah.
is about moving the whatever the burden on the enterprise, right, outside.
Yeah.
Now we are bringing the broker, then the broker management itself is becoming a burden for the enterprise. So, isn't it working the reverse side of the cloud? The success of cloud is it's completely moving out of the organization.
Yeah.
So they don't have to worry about things, server, anything.
Yeah.
Now I have to start worrying about this broker and everything.
Yeah.
How is this working out? How is the industry looking at this security broker as such?
See, I think you raise a good point, which is, but then end of the day, the way we look at it, and the way people think about this problem in general is, see, the cloud vendors themselves are doing a very good job. right, in terms of providing basic security. So if you look at Salesforce, they've got a lot of good stuff in place. You look at Amazon, they have a very, strong security model, APIs, identity management, and everything, right? But, beyond the point, the burden of consuming those services will fall on the person who's consuming them, and they need to look at their own use cases and figure out what is important, what is not important to them, and what is the kind of risk that they want to take. So if we are talking about moving the burden out and not deploying a proxy solution which has the overhead of managing more stuff in IT, then you could look at like an API-based solution, right? Which is again security as a service, right? And there we talked about it being light touch and lightweight, and then there it's yes, you just give the right authorization to the CASB to download the data, and that's it. There's nothing else to manage. You just log in, you check your alerts, and you're done, right? It's like a Google Analytics or an Omniture type of thing. It's kind of sitting there in the cloud, and you look at it when you want to look at it, kind of thing. Yeah. Okay, I think we're up in terms of time, so I'm happy to take questions after the session. Great.
Yeah,
Thanks a lot.
one
You can talk offline.
Okay,
We'll
sure.
know. But,